So this is part 2 on the Power and the People course, and previously we have seen King John clash with his barons. Now we're going to look at the reign of John's son, Henry III, and if you think he's going to be any more popular with his barons, you thought wrong. Okay, so let's go all the way back to 1216 at the end of the First Barons' War, and King John has just died, and his 9-year-old son Henry takes the throne. Obviously, he was very young, so a council of barons helped to rule for him until Henry came of age. Now, just like his father, Henry was quite strong-willed and always short of money. He also really wanted to win back some of the lands that his father had lost in France. To do that, he developed close ties to powerful French families. He married a French noblewoman called Eleanor of Provence, who brought her relatives with her called the Savoyards, who were given important positions in the government. This leads us to our first major grievance of the barons, which was the influence of foreigners in English government. As many powerful English nobles saw it, these Frenchmen were given influential positions in the realm that was meant for them. Now this is not just a story of a divide between the king and the barons, but also a personal fallout between Henry and one of his closest men, a guy called Simon de Montfort. Just to give you a bit of a backstory, Simon de Montfort was born in 1208 to a French noble family who had lands in both France and England. The de Montforts were one of the original Norman invading families, but had lost power and prestige over the years. When Simon came of age, he gave up his entitlements to any family land in France so that he could claim the title of the Earl of Leicester in England. Soon though, he became one of the king's favourites, and from 1234 onwards, he attended the Great Council, a group of the closest advisors to the king. He was even appointed steward of the royal household, the king's right-hand man. But to top it all off, in 1238, Simon married Henry's sister, also called Eleanor. However, Henry was meant to pay a huge dowry to Simon for this marriage, but he never did, which always made things a little bit rocky between the two. Nevertheless, de Montfort joined Henry on his disastrous invasion of France in 1242. To fund his wars, Henry called his Great Council, his Parliament, to discuss how to raise taxes. Just like his father, finances were a big grievance of the barons, as Henry was constantly short of money and always after more to fund his wars that went nowhere. In 1248, Henry sent Simon to Gascony to crush a rebellion. But de Montfort was ruthless against the Gascon population and to restore order. Many of the French nobles appealed to Henry for help, accusing de Montfort of illegal procedure and oppression. At this point, Henry sided with his French allies instead of de Montfort, and recalled de Montfort back from France in disgrace to put him on trial. This whole conflict, and the fact that the king had never paid him for his dowry, is what convinced de Montfort that Henry was not fit to be the king. So stepping back to looking at the barons again, and we've seen that they're really unhappy that Henry has so many foreigners government, asking to raise taxes and losing wars in France again. In 1258, the barons called a great council in Oxford, which was unusual because typically the king calls the great councils and not the other way around. They sat Henry down and presented him with a list of demands called the Provisions of Oxford, which many see as a continuation of the ideas of Magna Carta. The person who was instrumental in writing up these demands, none other than Simon de Montfort. The barons had a new spokesperson and a leader to represent them against the king. So what did the Provisions of Oxford actually say? Well, there are over 6 pages of demands, but we'll focus on the important ones. First of all foreign members of the royal household would be banished and only Englishmen could sit on the councils. Secondly, each county will decide their taxes locally instead of completely top-down from the king and a fair taxation system. Thirdly, there'd be changes to the Great Council, as 15 barons would be elected to sit on the council and watch over the king. Importantly, the king cannot make any decision without the approval of the council. This was a huge shift in royal authority, and for the first time in English history, the king would have to share his power. Now, not all the barons actually agreed with limiting royal power, and soon we see a split between these barons and the more radical ones led by de Montfort, wanting all barons to uphold the reforms forced upon the king. The unity of the barons was broken, as some sided with Henry and others with de Montfort. In 1263, Simon de Montfort led a rebellion against the king, which was called the Second Barons' War. The two armies went head-to-head against one another at the Battle of Luz in 1264, in which Simon defeated Henry and captured the king, as well as the Prince Edwards. For the next 15 months, de Montfort would be the ruler of England. Because de Montfort did not have all the barons on his side, he did something very, very interesting. He held a great council with the barons, but he also invites people from the commons. These are the knights from the countryside and the burgesses from the towns. For the first time, people from the commons, those who were not rich and powerful noblemen, were allowed to be involved in the decision-making process. Now, the knights and the burgesses could not vote, but they could have their voices heard. And if you look at English Parliament today, you have a House of Lords, and then you also have an elected House of Commons. Now, this looks very different to Parliament under Simon de Montfort, but many consider this to be the early forerunner to the Parliament system that we know today, involving the common people. These were new ideas about how the country should be run outside of the traditional ruling class. And this is why Simon de Montfort is sometimes considered the father of Parliament. Now, so Simon de Montfort is in power, but unfortunately for him, nothing lasts forever. What happened was that Prince Edward, who was held prisoner at Hereford Castle, had escaped. Suddenly, all the barons who did not support de Montfort now had a new leader to rally behind and formed an army. In 1265, the two sides met at the Battle of Evesham, where Edward's army crushed de Montfort. The prince took the traitor and had his body hacked into pieces and sent the parts around the country to be displayed as a warning. Now, the king is restored, and that should be the end of the story, right? Well, not quite. A few years down the line, in 1295, Edward I calls his model parliament, and he also invites the commons. This time, the commons are elected, and it's hard to imagine that without Simon de Montfort, this would have ever been achieved. And so, some say that Simon de Montfort sets a precedent for future leaders to involve the common people in the decision-making process. You could say that after the event, the king is still in power and in charge of everything, but we have new ideas about how the country should be run. In the next video, we'll take a look at the 14th century and be looking at the peasants' revolts. See you then.